Hey Paul, how are you today? So I just wanted to get your take on the recent article which came across our inbox recently. Sorry to bring you in at the last moment. I hope you had a minute to catch up with the article. We also have Joshil on call today.
Yeah, look, I did have a look at the article a few hours ago, mate, so I'm cool. Go ahead.
Great. Joshil, can you please bring us up to speed and let our listeners know what the article is about?
Sure, Bhargav. So the article that you had mentioned was about how the Western defense industry in particular, it's basically struggling to keep up with the growing demand in the current modern day and age. And in particular, we have come across multiple conflicts in the present world where Western allies are struggling to meet the demand and they're being outpaced by less superior opponents. So the article primarily discusses of how the Western defense complex could change its approach in producing and manufacturing weapons.
Joshil, thank you for that. It seems that West, as usual, is drowning in their own arrogance. Paul, I would love to get your take on this.
Oh, look, I'm not sure that it's arrogance. It could be just a belief that their political system and their military system is all-encompassing, superior, homogenic. And fundamentally, for the last, best part of a century, it has been. I think it's important, though, to point out the article sources. RealClearDefense.com is a very well-known think tank that publishes a lot of superb articles, and people should read it and take it quite seriously. But more so because it comes from Mike Mangan. Now, Mike Mangan, he basically produces a special report for us each week, but he's a very seasoned both military and financial sector analyst. And I don't mean, a research analyst, like everybody now is a research analyst or an analyst, but they've been out of uni for 2 years and they're living in a tier one city and they haven't done anything that has hardened their analytical skills. But when Mike Mangan, who we also have writing a superb article for us each week, when he decides to flick something through to us, take it pretty seriously. And I think the main thing to consider here is that the Western countries use very high-tech, very expensive weapon systems, and really that puts them at a disadvantage. Add to that, to re-equip those systems or to restock, when their operating expenses of production are much higher, then that's a double whammy. But when you also consider that the West, under leadership from the United States, is getting involved in all kinds of skirmishes. Now, these are not ad hoc in my view. I think my views are known that there's a battle going on against Russia under the name of Ukraine, but it's really about weakening a potential rival superpower. So when you spread yourself, in Russia, Ukraine, you're dogging at China, you're supporting Israel, the cost of these high-tech weapon systems and the costs of these future conflicts, not only to resupply weaponry, but the costs on your relationships and the power of those relationships when you lose. I'm thinking of Kabul, I'm thinking of Vietnam, but we can talk about a lot of other areas where it hasn't gone to plan. People start to question your agendas. So I think this article obviously has a lot of veracity, and I think the other thing we need to consider is the democratic situation in America leading up to the elections and how committed they will be if they have a change of government. So, I mean, that's my immediate feedback, Margaret.
Paul, with your military background, I am quite tempted to ask you about the effectiveness of such expensive weapon systems, specifically looking at the billions spent on refurbishing or reloading the Iron Dome in Israel or the ammunition in Ukraine, or even nearly $3 trillion bill on development of F-35 weapon system. So such expensive weapon systems, are they really effective on the ground when we look at such battlefields like Armenia, Ukraine, or even the shipping lanes in Gulf of Aden?
Look, good question, Barry. It really does depend on whether those, munitions and those systems are used as part of an overall force or whether they're just used as a magic wand. Unfortunately, for the last, 2 decades, maybe 3 decades, the idea of you cannot win and hold ground without infantry has become politically unacceptable because it leads to losses and it leads to people coming home in coffins or many more of them. So we've seen, a lot of people, visible media snippets of coffins draped in stars and stripes. So now they've even gone further away from infantry and we'll just get another country to fight our wars. Well, it's not sustainable because you're moving the deaths out of your backyard, but you're not helping your reputation. And so, if we look at any particular insurgency group, they're always going to fly under the radar. We saw what Hamas has done in Israel. We've seen, what Sam Kayona did in Bougainville. Agility and knowledge on the ground will always have an upper hand. Now, that doesn't mean that these major weapon systems aren't effective, aren't lethal. They certainly are. I'm not saying that for 1 minute. But if the strategy politically and militarily is not aligned, or the society won't keep voting in governments that fail or that have people coming home in body bags, there's a conundrum. You either have to have infantry on the ground and accept losses, or you have to accept that just using the high-tech systems is going to leave you vulnerable to more agile forces. And unfortunately, most of the Five Eyes military leaders have either become subservient and their want to be congenial has undermined their ability to do what they need to do, or alternatively, they're being overruled by their political masters. And in so doing, the freedom to operate, procure systems, put men on the ground, all the things you need to do, one-on-one, not negotiable. If you want to win, you need infantry. It's all about the infantry. You can hide that for a while and you can hide body bags, but you can't win when you don't have boots on the ground. So in summation, very effective weaponry, but not the be-all and end-all, okay?
So Paul, you mentioned Hamas, and that brings the focus down to innovation and ability to adapt on the ground to achieve their objective. Do you think innovation is one component that is lacking in the West? There seems to be, okay, I'm coming back to the good old conspiracy of military-industrial complex being a lobby which is pushing for expensive long-term research and development that doesn't seem to be compatible with today's battlefield. Do you think innovation is one component that is missing in the West and lost in all the lobby talks in the West?
In short, yes, I concur. I think I'd go a little bit deeper into that. I think the West is starting to innovate with companies like SpaceX, their rapid trial and error prototyping of rockets, and OpenAI, and with early release and testing of ChatGPT. These exemplify how the private sector or semi-private sector can develop capabilities faster. The problem really is emerging that, Russia's been showing to be a lot more innovative than people thought. It managed to repurpose Soviet-era high-explosive aviation bombs into glide bombs by retrofitting them with universal planning and correctional modules. These were all pointed out in that article, by the way. But these modules, on a cost comparison with what the West is using, is so excessively beneficial. And the same applies to drones. The cost of manufacturing drones in the West versus in the Soviet bloc, in China, in other locations, that cost differential is so enormous. And we're not just seeing it on the complex new weaponry, we're seeing it on the most critical of all munitions, and that's artillery shells. The West didn't have enough and picked a fight on a potential superpower, understating and showing a lot of prejudices and ignorant as to how unified Russia really is, as opposed to their belief reading their own propaganda in DC and in Canberra and in London. And as such, they're making strategic error, disastrous blunders to go into wars when you don't have an ability to supply your key partner with artillery munitions, whilst being aggressive against China, whilst wanting to back Israel's human rights record to the hilt in a blind way, is of great concern. If you throw onto that, things like Silicon Valley in America used to be the source of innovation. China copied it, and now you've got a situation where China's worked out it can't just copy. If it wants to take the lead and be a serious superpower, it needs to set up its own centres and its own ability to innovate and critically fund it. The innovation in the West, the scary thing about it is the cost of innovating in the West, even though they have almost unlimited supply of capital, like in the dot-com days, investors are becoming more wary. But they do still have that advantage of capital in the West, but they've got a massive competitive disadvantage in the costs of labour, the costs of compliance, the costs of rentals. So really, I do think the article's basis is very true. The West is perhaps getting behind the curveball and again being ignorant to that fact. I think it's a very wise piece of work with this article. Whether it's heeded is another question, Bhargav.
Thank you for that, Paul. We will round off the discussion here, but I will leave it with one thought. That is, back in 2020, there was a conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan, being close to Turkey, brought in their Baytar, the famous Baytar drones, and picked off the Russian armored vehicles of Armenia and won the conflict effectively. Apparently, the West hasn't really learned from that, and they continue to invest billions into it. So, Paul, any final words to it?
Yeah, Bhargav, look, I mean, I look at, my alumni, my classmates, indeed, many of whom have become brigadiers and generals. And when I chat with them, it's clear that, with maybe one or two notable exceptions, it's clear that their ability to think independently, strategically, and retain the critical tactical knowledge is diluted by needing to survive within an army that has become ostensibly a part of a political machine. Sadly, the West's greatest drama, and we're going to see this in America soon, we've seen it in Australia for the last 2 decades. It doesn't really matter whether the left or the right, or the inner left and the inner right, or the far left or the far right, or whatever they want to be coined. It doesn't matter what political party's in. You have an endemic toxicity called the public service, and you have career politicians that are even well funded when they're in opposition. So the motivation to change things has gone on. But I think the military's independence, and we talk about the separations of state and the media and the judicial system and parliament, but really we need to also think about whether the military should be deployed at the whim of politicians. I mean, surely that warrants a referendum, but at the moment, way too fewer people that aren't qualified or understand the destructive natures of war and are immune from its impacts get to decide who goes to war. And I think that leads us to perhaps our next audio, and that is the American election. Where's it going? And it's going to prove to be that there's going to be some civil unrests in America, like they were last time, but how severe they will be very interesting. And perhaps we can schedule a call on that next week, okay?
Certainly, Paul, we'll do so. And thank you for your thoughts. Thank you, Jeshil, for the quick intro. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. See you. Bye-bye.